Hello and welcome back. This is the week 10 lecture. So we are continuing our work with definition this week. I hope to build on what we did last week, and we're sort of taking the next step. So one thing that we will be doing that's a little bit different than what we've been doing the last couple of weeks, we will have an official reading assignment again. I want to show you guys a couple of examples of sort of short definition essays, so we can observe what the authors of those essays are doing, what kinds of methods and strategies they're using to provide more extensive, more elaborate definitions. So that's really what we're talking about this week. We're still working with a lot of the same concepts that we covered last week, but now we're going to talk more about stipulative definitions, and also we're going to talk about extended definitions, because ultimately that's what we're going to be doing next week when we start working on essay 3. You can really consider one example of an extended definition to be a definition essay, like the type that we will be writing soon. So we're going to start thinking more in those terms, and again, we'll look at a couple of examples of definition essays this week, and you'll have a chance to respond to them in your discussion post. So by now, we should be pretty comfortable with formal definitions. We spent all of last week really focusing on the types of definitions that we can find in dictionaries. And I wanted us to take some time to really notice all the different types of information that we get in a standard formal definition that we can look up in an online dictionary like Merriam-Webster. So we talked about synonyms, the examples of the word being used in a sentence, even getting that pronunciation guide so we know how to say the word, synonyms, antonyms, the etymology, all of the different things we saw. We're going to still use a lot of those strategies, because as we'll notice today and throughout the week, when we start doing more stipulative definitions, when we start doing more extended definitions, we are writing more, we're creating more. We can't just copy these down from Merriam-Webster, but we are going to use some of the same strategies that we noticed in Merriam-Webster. We can still use synonyms. We're still going to use some etymology at times. We can use that negation strategy, understanding or explaining what a word is or what a concept is, in part by explaining what it's not. So we can still do a lot of those things even when we start defining more complex things. So I wanted to start with a definition today, the definition of language according to Merriam-Webster, because this is pretty applicable and important for us this week. So Merriam-Webster, the resource we were hopefully using last week, defines language as the following. Words, obviously, lots of words. We've been studying individual words. Also, their pronunciation, that's important, and the methods of combining them that are used and understood by a language community. So I really want to focus on the second half of the definition. We understand the words and the pronunciation, but let's think more about the methods of combining words and the methods that are used and understood by a larger community. I was sort of talking about this a little bit last week. Language is really shaped by the users of that language. So all of us speak English. We all write in English. We might have mastery of other languages too, but we can all be considered members of an English-speaking community. We all speak English, we all write in English, that's largely how we communicate, so we are a language community. There are lots of these. You can get as sort of minute and specific as you want, but you can just think maybe in more national terms, like the places where English is spoken, the countries where English is spoken, right? Those are particular language communities where the users will obviously use language in order to make themselves understood and communicate. But like I was talking about last week, when users start to make changes to the language, when they start to maybe alter the meaning of a word, or when a word just starts getting used in a slightly different way than it previously got used, those are decisions and those are trends that really get made and created by the people in those language communities. And then once it becomes clear that a change has occurred or a new word has been introduced to the language, the dictionary writers and the teachers and the experts kind of catch up to the usage. The usage usually changes or develops first, and then we add the word to the dictionary, or then it becomes common knowledge that, oh, we use it like this now, or oh, the word does that now. So again, we do have a lot of power as members of a language community because we are changing the language. As our society changes, as we change, the language will change too. But obviously the most important thing about words and using words is to be able to combine them, put them together in our own writing in order to make ourselves understood to other members of our language community. So we can certainly think of our individual classes as being language communities, and really not just this English class that you're in, but really any class that you're in, with the exception potentially of foreign language classes where you might be members of different language communities. But in your science classes, in your math classes, in English classes, of course, you are using English to communicate. You are using that language. So you have to know how to put your words together. You have to know how to put your sentences together. And we kind of already know that instinctively, but it's just useful. The reason I wanted to start last week with individual words, it's just useful to start from the beginning, to start with the most basic unit or element of language, individual words, and seeing how much we can learn and do with individual words. Just to kind of underscore the fact that, if we're starting with words, it's great to know words and it's great to learn about words, but the next step would be sentences. And then the next step after that would be paragraphs. So that's really what we're talking about with extended definitions, writing definitions that will take us multiple sentences, multiple paragraphs. And in the process of creating those, we are ultimately creating essays. And that's what we want to do this week. But let's kind of start with the stuff that we talked about last week. So again, we're familiar by now with formal definitions. So we hopefully are noticing by now some of the ways in which a formal definition of a word can serve as a springboard or a launching point for a more elaborate, detailed exploration of the word. So I was kind of hoping that's what would happen last week with our discussion post. We started just copying down the formal definitions from Merriam-Webster, but then I asked you guys to come up with a stipulative definition. And in order to do that, you had to write a few sentences, right? You had to provide some context, maybe an entire paragraph to make the word make sense, to make the word actually do something. And so your readers, your fellow members of this language community can understand how you're using the word and what the word is supposed to do. So we're already kind of noticing that the formal definition is a great place to start, but it's usually not where we end, right? It's getting us ready to kind of move into a more complex, elaborate style of definition. And that ultimately is what we often end up with when we write our stipulative definition. So again, when we have a stipulative definition, what that means is we are specifying the exact meaning or usage of a word, the way we are going to use the word in our own writing. So like we said last week, and I asked you guys to sort of think of examples of words that have a lot of different meanings, or words where maybe we can observe that the meaning has changed over time. Maybe the word means something a little bit different now than it meant 100, 200, 500 years ago. So we can usually find examples of this. I probably mentioned the word pride as a prime example of one of these words. Pride can mean a lot of different things depending on how we are using it. So this is really what we're getting at when we talk about stipulative definitions. For example, we might read a definition essay that is defining pride simply as, a healthy sense of self-respect. And that is a definition that we can find if we look the word up. And that is often what people mean when they say pride. If you've ever had a teacher tell you, take pride in your work, that's largely the sense of the word that they're using, the way they're using the word. And we recognize that. We usually understand that. But we probably also understand that the word pride can be used in other ways. And in some cases, it can have negative connotations. If somebody has too much pride, or perhaps pride is clouding their judgment in some way. So you can use the word in different ways. So usually an author will need to make it clear. They'll need to provide a stipulative definition to indicate to their audience, okay, this is how I'm going to use it. When I say pride, I mean a healthy sense of self-respect. And then that would be the usage, that would be the meaning of the word that we would be dealing with as readers for the rest of that essay. And if the author wanted to change, he would give us a new stipulative definition to indicate that he's going to start using the word in a different way. So that's really what a stipulative definition does. It stakes out our own unique ground, our own unique usage of the word. But on your way to arriving at a stipulative definition, you really have to learn all about the word. So before you can really decide how you're going to use the word pride in your essay, you really sort of need to look up the word, look at formal definitions, and really get a better understanding, a more complete understanding of all the different ways that people use the word. You need to look at a lot of examples of the word being used in sentences. And again, Merriam-Webster can do this for you. You can look at those examples and you can see that in some cases the word can be used in a positive way. In other cases it can be a negative thing. Sometimes it's kind of referred to as something that maybe you want a little bit of but not a whole lot of. So you can get a feel for the full range of the word's different meanings and different usages, and then you can decide, okay, well, this is how I'm going to use it. You can pick one of those potential meanings, and then you can make it your own. You can explain that this is how you want to use the word because it's helping you achieve your larger purpose. Always keep that in mind. Whenever you're coming up with a stipulative definition, it's always serving a larger purpose. You are clarifying the particular way that you want to use the word in order to suit your larger purpose, right? You're using the word to help you accomplish your larger goals. So the definition is always a part of that larger whole, that larger paper, essay, whatever, the larger writing project that you are undertaking. So we could go a very different direction with the word pride. I could write a different definition essay where I create the stipulative definition that, for me, pride is all about, ruining personal relationships and, putting yourself in front of others. And I could really use it in a negative way. So if I was going to use the word in that way, I would need to stipulate a meaning of pride that does have more of a negative sense, a more negative connotation, too much, the harms that it can cause. But again, I can make that clear by providing a stipulative definition. But that stipulative definition is going to be more subjective. It's going to be more personalized. It's going to require, in some cases, a little bit more explanation. That's why the definitions are getting longer now. We notice that many formal definitions are pretty brief. Even if a word has a lot of different meanings, a lot of those individual explanations or glosses of the word will be pretty brief. A lot of formal definitions are written to be read quickly, to be read and understood quickly and efficiently. But once we start dealing more with stipulative and extended definitions, we simply have to write more. So you'll notice that sometimes your stipulative definition might not be all that different from the formal definition. Again, you're not necessarily changing the meaning. In some cases, you're just choosing from one of many potential meanings. In other cases, like we were talking about last week with ephemeral, you can use the word in kind of a figurative way, right? You might not be using it in a way that squares up exactly with that literal, exact, formal definition, that denotation of the word that you can look up in the dictionary, but you're capturing more of a feeling, the way something feels to you. You're capturing a sensation or an experience. And sometimes the language we use to do that isn't literal. We're speaking more figuratively, right? And that's okay. You can slightly bend what the word means, or sort of the range of that word's meaning, so you can fit your stipulative definition in there. And again, that's fulfilling your purpose, right? You're doing that for a reason. If I want to talk about my childhood and how it feels to me now as a much older person, I could use the word ephemeral in a very particular way. It's not totally different from the formal definition, but I can use it in my own way to express my own meaning, in my own writing. But again, that usually takes a little bit of work to explain that. And again, if it's a word like pride, you might simply have to tell your readers, okay, this is the meaning of pride that I'm using. Because there's a bunch, right? So you might have to narrow it down for them, or you might have to explain that, hey, I'm using this kind of metaphorically, perhaps not literally. You might not have to necessarily spell that out always, but you have to provide some kind of stipulative definition that clues the reader in, that lets your audience know, okay, this is how they are using that word. And again, sometimes this might take a few sentences. Sometimes this might take a few paragraphs, depending on the complexity of whatever it is that you're defining. So let's just think about a few other potential examples. So I took a few of these from other disciplines, so I don't know as much about these disciplines, but you guys very well might. So think about, for example, a physics textbook. And the author of the book wants to use the word pressure. They are going to be using that word in a particular way to explain these scientific concepts. So in order to really explain to their readers what pressure means in this context, in this particular situation, they're going to have to do a little bit more than just give us the brief formal definition, like from Merriam-Webster, because here's what it would be. And you can see what I mean. This isn't really enough for this kind of scenario. We need a more extended stipulative definition, because all the formal definition tells us, as far as what the word pressure means, is it's the force applied to a given surface. Okay, well, that's very general, that's very broad. It's a good place to start, but we don't just want a general understanding of the word. We are reading a physics textbook. We need a pretty good, detailed, sort of nuanced understanding of the word. We need to go beyond the formal definition. We need more detail. We need more explanation. So if the author of the textbook only gave us the formal definition, that really wouldn't give us a good sense of how they plan to use the word. Because again, pressure, much like the word pride, it has a lot of different usages. It has a lot of different potential meanings. We use the word in different ways. Like we can talk about water pressure. We can talk about the pressure put on somebody, right? Sometimes pressure can affect people. It can affect surfaces. It can affect a lot of things. So we can use the word in different ways to mean different things. So the problem with just providing the formal definition is that the author isn't really narrowing it down for the readers. They're not allowing the readers to eliminate the other potential usages of the word and understand exactly how this textbook is going to use the word. So in addition to that formal definition, the author really needs to provide a stipulative definition as well. And in the process, it will become a more extended definition. They're going to have to at least provide a few additional sentences, maybe some additional paragraphs to explain what the author means in this particular context when the author uses the word pressure. because it might not be exactly the same way I use the word pressure if I'm talking about sports or if I'm talking about some other situation. So that's the value of a stipulative definition. It's ultimately not for you so much as it's for your audience. It is for your readers, so they understand exactly what you mean by a particular word. So again, sometimes that might just take a few sentences. Sometimes it might take even more. It might take a paragraph or multiple paragraphs to do that work. But the transition that we're really making this week is moving from individual words and thinking about defining individual words to really thinking more about larger concepts. And that's really where extended definitions come in. That's the whole point, the whole value of extended definitions, because when we go beyond individual words, we are definitely going to have to write more. We're going to have to provide more examples. Again, we're still using a lot of the same strategies that we use in those simple formal definitions: synonyms, antonyms, etymology, plenty of examples, but we just need more of it. We need more explanation, we need more detail, and we need more use of all those strategies. And that's especially true when we start to define things, or people, or groups of people, qualities, traits, characteristics, ideas, or other larger entities. When we start to define stuff like that, we must employ extended definitions. So extended definitions usually treat subjects that are a bit complex, in some cases a bit vague or abstract. And we'll talk more about that. We've already kind of mentioned abstract language when we were talking about description and how we often use figurative language to capture sort of more abstract things that can't always be picked up and held and sort of physically contained. So again, we're sort of in that territory again. How do we take abstract, hard to understand stuff and make it concrete, clear, direct, and easier to understand? Definition is a great way to do that. But also, we sometimes want to define things that are really loaded with certain values or certain emotions, things that people are very passionate about, things that we often disagree about. Things that often spark maybe disagreements or misunderstandings. That's often why we want to use extended definition, to try to show, hey, this thing is this. It's not that. We're arguing about what it is. Half of us think it's this, the other half think it's that. I'm telling you it's this. So sometimes it can be a way to sort of intervene in an argument or a debate. Sometimes it can be used to persuade, to try to show people this is how we need to understand this concept or this person or this, social development. Here's how we understand it. Here's what it is. Because once we have defined something, once we have synonyms for it and antonyms and some sense of a history behind it, once we can use it in a sentence, once we have examples of it, then truly we can understand it and then we can do something with it. So again, a few examples if we're thinking about stuff that we might need to use extended definitions for. Again, moving beyond just looking up words. Some of these might just be individual words, but we have to do more than just look for their formal definition online. So again, we're talking about abstract concepts like patriotism or love. I mean, you could look those words up. Right? You could find plenty of formal definitions of those words, but those are rather abstract qualities or concepts, right? You can't pick up and hold love. I can't pick up and show you patriotism, right? These are ideas, and they can be represented or symbolized by a lot of different things, right? But everybody has their own take on those concepts, right? The way I define love or patriotism would be different than the way my neighbor or a family member or a friend would define those terms. And that doesn't necessarily mean that one of us is right or wrong. It just means that we have different stipulative definitions, different extended definitions of these concepts. We would use different examples of them, or they would represent themselves in different ways in our lives or in our minds. So, that's how we can create more original work around these kinds of words. Again, looking beyond just the formal definition, because we can always look those up, but thinking more about, what does that word mean to me? How would I explain it? How would I describe it? How would I provide examples of it? So we often need these kinds of extended definitions for abstract concepts that, again, we could define them from a dictionary, but that's not going to be enough. Just like just providing the formal definition of the word pressure is really not enough in that physics textbook. We need more. We need more of a stipulative and extended definition. Other cases where we might want to do this would be anytime we're perhaps introducing a new word to a language community. Maybe it's a slang term that is becoming sort of standardized in its usage. It hasn't been around very long, but young people use it. It's increasingly heard. It's increasingly used both in speech and in writing. So at some point, that new word, it might have begun as slang. It might have begun its life as sort of unofficial language, like not in the dictionary. But if it gets used enough, if it becomes common enough, it will probably make its way into the dictionary. It will sort of join the ranks of our language, and our language community sort of decides on that without actually ever sitting down and talking about it. We just decide because we're using the word, we understand the word, and eventually that word just becomes a part of the language. So the textbook that I'm using, an old compact reader from years ago that I'm using to pull some of these concepts, their example of a slang term that you might want to use an extended definition for would be like the word hype. That was their example of a slang term that needs to be defined in a more extended way so that readers understand how the usage of that word had perhaps changed a bit. The book is like 10 or 15 years old. So you guys, especially if you are young people, you can probably think of better, more contemporary examples of slang terms that are used a lot and they are commonly understood. But if you're writing an essay for old people or, an instructor, you would have to explain the word. And again, a simple formal definition, even if there is one by now, is not going to be enough if you kind of understand that at least some of your readers will not be familiar with this new word. So that's why you might want an extended definition to explain it a little bit more, provide more examples, make it easier to understand. So we might need to do that for new words. Oh, another example would be like clickbait. That's another example from the book that I'm using for this chapter. Again, I don't know how new that word is anymore, but at a certain point, maybe 10 to 15 years ago, people did have to learn what that word meant, right? As a result of us spending more time online. So we learned the word became established, the definition for it became well known, so we don't need to have it explained to us now. But in 2010, maybe somebody would have needed to have the term clickbait described to them in an extended definition so they would understand it. Because again, these words are new at one time. They might not be new to us anymore, but we can see why when there is a new word and we're introducing it, we have to explain it. We need an extended definition. Also, if we're dealing with really anything super complex, like complex scientific terms, like neuroplasticity, right? That's a term that some people already understand. Some people working within that discipline, within that field, they certainly understand it, but a lot of regular people don't, right? So it's an unfamiliar term. So you're going to need more than just a formal definition. You're going to need to give us more examples, more of an explanation, perhaps simplify some of the language in that explanation. And this is true if you're talking about like clinical terms as well, diagnosing somebody as hyperactive, or talking about a term like sort of from like psychology, like schizophrenia. To define that term, yes, you could find a simple formal definition, but again, you would need a more extended definition to go beyond just, the basic formal or denotation. We would just need more. You could write more, provide more detail. And remember, this is to accomplish something larger. This is to help us create a larger whole. Whatever we are trying to achieve in our writing, the definition is helping us to do it. So that's, again, what extended definitions can move us towards bigger purposes, bigger goals. That's what we want. So in some cases, we might be defining in order to persuade an audience. We're trying to persuade people to accept a certain definition, a certain way of understanding or perceiving a word or a concept, or again, could even do this with a group of people, trying to argue for a particular stipulative definition that you want your readers to accept for some reason. In other cases, your primary goal might simply be to explain. But again, you're explaining something complex, something larger, and definition is just part of that. And then in other cases, you might be trying to provide an alternative perspective, a new way of understanding something. In some cases, definition can be done largely to entertain, but also going back to explaining, like, you can get a lot of mileage out of explaining, right? One of the examples that we're looking at this week, really both, I would argue, one of the big goals in both is simply to explain their subject. But depending on the subject, you're going to have to do a lot of different kinds of explanation. So in the one example that we're reading, they're talking about really a group of people, a particular generation of people, and that's really what's getting defined, is that group. And they're being defined in large part through their experiences, through sort of what they talk about in the interviews that we see in that article, and also in these sort of like shared traits. The author of the article is identifying certain things that this group shares, certain things that they have in common that make them different from other groups, other generations. So if you pick the Taylor Swift article for Essay 2, this one's a little bit similar in that it's very much about differences between generations and how sort of current generation of young people is a bit different from other groups. And it's largely trying to define this group based on what they're doing, sort of how they're feeling, their attitudes towards work, and sort of new developments that are going on with that particular group. So that's often what we might be trying to explain: a social trend, a new development in our culture or in our society. In other cases, it might be more of a concept or a scientific term, again, a clinical term, like some of those examples we just ran through. The other example that we're reading this week is a very extended definition of American football, the sport. So even if you're not a fan, I still want you to read it, because it's a quick read, it's easy, and I want you to notice just sort of what they are doing, what strategies they're using to define a sport. So the sport can be thought of as a pretty material, physical thing. I mean, it really exists. We can see it. We can watch it. But it's defining the sport largely through an extended etymology. Just like we can have the history or origin of a word, that extended definition of football basically gives us the etymology of football. Where did it come from? What are its origins? How did it develop? How did it grow into the sport that we recognize now? So you wouldn't really need somebody to give you a formal definition of American football, even if you're not a fan, even if you don't watch. You know what it is, right? I mean, you at least have a general idea of what it is. Even if you don't necessarily know all the rules or ever sit down to watch, you know the basic formal definition. but by providing an extended definition, a lot more information is made available, and we attain a much higher level of mastery. Whether or not that's something we really wanted is a different story, but that's just an example of what extended definition can do. So I want you to notice the strategies that are being used in these two examples, and I'm basically telling you the strategies now so you don't have to worry if you're finding them or not. Well, I want you to find them, but you know what you're looking for. Okay, so in the first example, like sample 1, the article about Gen Z workers, I really want you to think about examples and negation. Those are the two strategies from last week that really show up the most in that article. So you get tons of examples of actual members of Gen Z and their experiences. The author interviews many of them. So we get many of their direct quotes. We actually hear them in their own words, and they're talking about experiences they've had, concerns they have, perspectives they have. So plenty of examples, and you could certainly track those in a quantitative way. You know, you could count them up, and you should notice names, because many of these speakers, many of these individual examples are getting named. They're not always anonymous. Okay, so look for examples, and then also look for negation. So a little bit like looking at antonyms. Like we said last week, one good way to understand what a word means is to also understand what it does not mean. Understand the opposite of its meaning. So you just have a more complete picture of what it is and what it isn't. Remember, we said that's part of what definition is. You're creating boundaries. You're establishing what something is and what the limit of it is. So it's like you're putting some kind of fence around the concept or the idea. Here's what it is, and here's what it's not. You're staking out the ground that it gets to have, and that's part of, making those boundaries, making your own stipulative extended definition. So that's going on in there too. We're hearing a lot of what Gen Z doesn't want. So give me some examples of negation. What do they not want? What are they not willing to do? And again, this gets us to differences perhaps between this particular group of people and other groups of people. So again, we need to use definition to understand how one group might be different than another group. Okay, they're not totally different in every way. We don't want to make too many divisions, but that's part of the way we can learn and understand. Understanding this group compared to another group. So yeah, those are the main two strategies in the Gen Z article: examples and negation. In the American football article, I would say it's mostly etymology, and again, using that term in a more broad sense. So not just the origin and history of a single word, but rather the origin and history of the concept, the thing being defined, which in this case is American football. But you'll notice it's very similar to how an etymology of a word would work, right? Because the first thing you see with the etymology is where the word came from. What was it derived from? Maybe a Greek word, a Latin word, a French word. Where does it come from? That's very much how the football article is structured. It's telling us where American football came from, the origin, and then it's also telling us the development. So that's what etymology does. It gives us the origin, here's what it came from, and then by showing us the examples or the different usages over time, we can see how words change. We can see how words might develop, how the meaning might change, and we'll notice in the article we're going to be able to observe some of the ways that American football developed and changed. Grew from its original form into something more modern and recognizable that we would understand today. So really just etymology and example two, but really dig into the history. Again, try to pick out some specific years, some specific developments, some specific events that prove to be important in the historical development and process of this thing. So again, part of defining might just be learning the history, learning where it came from and how it became or becomes what we know now. So that's the discussion post for this week. Read those 2 examples and then respond to my questions in the post. And then next week we can start getting moving on essay 3. I just want to make a quick note, if anybody's still watching by this point, if you have missing discussion posts, if you have any late work that you need to get in, go ahead and submit it. You don't need to ask me about it in an email. Just get that stuff in. We are kind of getting near the end of our discussion posts. We only have, I think, 3 more. We only have 2 more after this week's discussion. So you need to get caught up on the posts. If you're still missing any, submit them. I can at least give you partial credit, and you want to get that done soon. So if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you next week as we get moving on Essay 3.